My name is Mia Carter. I'm 26, and I found out I wasn't real family in a wood-panelled attorney's office with a tissue box between me and my mother. Greg sat beside her like a judge. Dylan lounged in the leather chair like he already owned the house. And Evan, 14 and quiet, kept staring at his hands. The attorney cleared his throat and said my name once, like an afterthought, then went back to listing what Greg was leaving his sons. My ears rang. My mouth went dry. It wasn't the money that gutted me. It was the certainty in their faces, like they'd been practicing my erasure for years. Before I go on, tell me where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been the kid who did everything right and still got treated like an afterthought when family and money were on the line. I read the comments, and you'd be shocked how many inheritance stories start exactly like this. Quiet, unfair, and decided long before anyone tells you the truth. I was 14 when my mother remarried, old enough to understand that something big was changing, but still young enough to believe it might turn out okay if I behaved well enough. We moved into Greg Holloway's house at the edge of town, the kind of suburban place with beige siding, a 2-car garage, and a driveway that always smelled faintly of motor oil and cut grass. From the outside, it looked like the kind of home people pointed at and said, "That's a good family neighborhood." Inside, the rules shifted almost immediately. Greg didn't yell. That was the part that made it harder to fight back. He spoke calmly, firmly, like everything he said was reasonable and final. He liked order, chores on a whiteboard, shoes lined up by the door, dishes washed before bed. In theory, none of that was unfair. In practice, the rules only seemed to stick to me. Dylan, Greg's son, was 3 years older than me and already acted like the house was his by right. He left plates in the sink, to soak, for days. He borrowed things without asking. My headphones, my hoodie, my shampoo that mysteriously emptied twice as fast once he moved in. If I mentioned it, Greg would tilt his head and say, "You need to be more flexible. Families share." Then, later that night, I'd get a lecture about attitude. My mum, Rachel, hovered in the background like a stage manager trying to keep the show running. She smiled too much. She smoothed things over. She said things like, "We're all adjusting," and "Let's not make a big deal out of it." I learned early that if I pushed back too hard, I became the problem she had to manage. About a year in, they announced the pregnancy. I remember my mum standing in the kitchen, hands folded over her stomach, smiling in a way that looked both excited and nervous. Greg hugged her from behind. Dylan whooped. I smiled too, because that's what you do when you don't know how to feel yet. A week later, Greg stood in my bedroom doorway and looked around like he was evaluating a rental. "This room gets the best light," he said. "It'll be perfect for the nursery." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. By the end of the month, my posters were gone, my desk was folded up, and my life was stacked into boxes in the guest room. The guest room was barely wide enough for a twin bed and a narrow dresser. My boxes stayed stacked against the wall because there was nowhere else to put them. Greg called it temporary. It didn't feel temporary when I had to climb over my own belongings just to get dressed. That was the first time I understood how easy it was for them to move me aside. When Evan was born, the house revolved around him. His cries set the schedule. His naps determined the noise level, except when Dylan had friends over. Then the rules bent again. Late-night laughter, music thumping through the walls, doors slamming. If I complained, Greg said I needed to be more understanding. "He's young," he said, meaning Dylan. Or maybe he meant Evan. It was never clear. School became my escape. I stayed late. I joined clubs I didn't care about just to have somewhere to be. I did homework in the library until it closed. Home felt like a place where I took up space without ever being invited to. One night, when I was 16, I came home later than usual after a group project. The house was silent. No TV, no voices, just the hum of the refrigerator. On the fridge door, held up by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, was a note in my mum's handwriting. "Went out. Food's in the fridge. No, sorry. No, we missed you. No, call us." I stood there longer than I want to admit, staring at those 4 words like they might rearrange themselves into something kinder. I ate cold leftovers alone at the counter, listening to the clock tick. That was the night it settled in my chest that I wasn't just overlooked. It was optional. Things came to a head just before my 18th birthday. I'd been working on a big project for school, one that actually mattered for college applications. I set up my materials in the corner of the living room because it was the only space with enough light. Within minutes, Dylan turned on music. Evan started running laps through the room, shrieking with the kind of energy only kids have. Greg complained about the mess. When I asked for 10 minutes of quiet, he sighed like I'd asked for the moon. I packed everything up and went to a friend's house instead. Her parents barely glanced up when I explained what I needed. They cleared a spot on the dining table and said, "You're safe here." Just like that. No conditions, no sighs. I worked for hours in silence, and something inside me unclenched. I didn't know it then, but that night planted the idea that would change everything. The idea of leaving didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, the way exhaustion does. After that night at my friend's house, I started picking up extra shifts at my part-time job. Closing shifts, weekend shifts, any excuse not to be home. Greg noticed, of course. He always noticed when my life stopped revolving around his rules. "You're working too much," he said one evening at dinner, his tone measured but sharp. "It's going to hurt your grades." I nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining that my grades were the only thing I could control. What he didn't say, what I understood perfectly, was that he didn't like me being gone. When I wasn't around, there was no one to blame when things went wrong. By the time I turned 18, the thought of staying felt unbearable. I found a small apartment near campus. It wasn't pretty. Beige walls, thin carpet, a kitchen that barely fits one person at a time. But it was affordable, and more importantly, it was mine. I counted my savings over and over, making sure I could cover the first few months of rent. Every dollar felt like a tiny piece of freedom. Telling them was the hardest part. I waited until after dinner, when Evan was already in bed, and Dylan was scrolling on his phone. I sat across from Greg and my mom at the kitchen table, my hands folded so they wouldn't shake. "I'm moving out," I said. The silence was immediate and heavy. Greg leaned back in his chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he didn't believe me. "You think you're ready to live on your own?" he asked. "Because you're 18? "I've thought about it," I said. "I have a place. I've saved enough." His face hardened. He launched into a list of everything I supposedly didn't understand. Bills, responsibility, loyalty. He accused me of being selfish, ungrateful. He brought up Evan, said I was abandoning my family, that my brother looked up to me. My mom barely spoke. When she did, it was softer, but somehow worse. "Families stick together," she said, staring at the table. "You'll regret it if you leave." That was the moment I knew no one was going to stop me or protect me. Not really. The morning I moved out, my mum came into the guest room while I was packing. We didn't talk about the argument. She handed me extra boxes and offered old utensils I might need. We circled around the truth like it was something fragile that might break if we touched it. When I locked the door to my apartment for the first time, I felt everything at once. Relief, fear, grief. The silence was overwhelming. For the first few nights, I lay awake missing sounds I'd sworn I hated. Dylan's music, Evan's footsteps, even Greg's voice complaining about something. Then, slowly, the quiet became a gift. I learned who I was without constant tension humming in the background. Life settled into a rhythm. School, work, rent. Groceries from Walmart late at night when the aisles were empty. I paid my own bills. I studied at my own table. I slept without worrying about someone barging into my space. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding my breath until I finally let it go. My relationship with my mum and Greg changed after I moved out. It didn't get better exactly. It got thinner, polite. We saw each other occasionally, holidays, birthdays. I kept things light because anything deeper felt dangerous. Then came the phone call. My mum's voice sounded careful, almost formal. She told me Greg had been thinking about his will after a health scare. She paused, like she was bracing herself. He's decided to include Dylan and Evan, she said. But not you, because they're his biological children. He thinks it makes more sense. I remember staring at the wall while she spoke. A small crack near the ceiling. A shadow shifted as a car passed outside. My chest tightened, but I didn't cry. I understand, I said. And in a way, I did. It wasn't about the money. I hadn't expected anything from Greg. What hurt was how cleanly he said it, how final it sounded, like a rule that had always existed and was only now being stated out loud. That night, I lay awake, thinking about every moment I'd tried to earn my place. Every time I'd been told to be flexible, to compromise, to be grateful, and how none of it had changed the outcome. I pulled back after that. Fewer visits, shorter calls. I focused on finishing school, on building something that didn't depend on their approval. Slowly, the old ache dulled. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need anything from them. I believed it, right up until the day a lawyer I'd never heard of called my phone and asked for me by name. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right between patients. I was rinsing instruments at the sink when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. "Is this Mia Carter?" a man asked when I stepped into the hallway. "Yes. My name is Landon Price. I'm an estate attorney calling regarding Margaret Carter." The name landed softly at first, then echoed. Margaret. My great-aunt. A distant presence from my childhood, more rumour than memory. I remembered a thin woman with sharp eyes at a funeral once, her hands steady on my shoulder as she told me to stand up straight. "She passed away last month," Landon continued. "She named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate." For a second I thought I'd misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" He repeated it, slower this time. Trust. Properties. Investments. A number so large it didn't feel real. $3 million. I leaned against the wall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. My hands were shaking. I kept waiting for the catch, for him to say my name had come up by mistake, that there was another Mia Carter somewhere. But there wasn't. "She left a letter for you," he added. "I'll forward it with the documents." I finished my shift in a fog. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table and read Margaret's letter 3 times. She wrote about watching me grow up from a distance, about independence, about recognizing something familiar in me. She said she wanted me to have choices she hadn't. I cried harder than I expected, not because of the money, because someone had seen me. For 2 weeks I told no one. I met with Landon. I listened. I signed papers. I asked careful questions. I opened a new notebook and wrote everything down because I was terrified of missing something important. When the funds were transferred, I didn't celebrate. I went to work the next day like nothing had changed. I needed time to breathe. The first crack came from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, Troy. He messaged me on Facebook with a smiley face and a "Hey, stranger!" that made my stomach drop. He asked vague questions about how I was doing. Then he mentioned Margaret. "You must be relieved," he said. "She always said she'd take care of family." I didn't respond. The next day, my mum called. Her voice was warmer than it had been in months. She asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was eating well. Then she sighed and said, "Things had been really hard lately." I waited. Greg's health bills, Evan's school. The house is in need of repairs. She didn't ask outright. She didn't have to. The implication hung between us like humidity. "I know you don't owe us anything," she said carefully. "I just thought, family helps family." I told her I needed time. She said she understood. Her tone changed just enough for me to hear the disappointment. By the end of the week, everyone knew. Dylan called next. He sounded friendly, almost respectful, in a way that felt rehearsed. "Congrats," he said. "Really, you deserve it." That was new. He talked about starting a business, about how hard it was to get ahead, about how nice it would be to have someone in the family who could invest. I told him I wasn't interested. "You've changed," he said lightly, but there was an edge underneath. Then the messages started coming from relatives I barely remembered. Everyone had a reason, a need, a story about fairness. I stopped answering. The cafe meeting was my mum's idea. She wanted to clear the air. I agreed, hoping, stupidly, that this might be about us. She didn't ask how I was doing. She talked about stress, about sacrifice, about everything she'd given up. Halfway through her second coffee, she leaned forward and said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I expect you to write me a check for $1 million. The room went quiet. I could hear the espresso machine behind the counter. My hands went cold. "That money should have been mine," she added. "It came from your father's side." I said no. Her face hardened. She accused me of being selfish, of forgetting where I came from. When I stood up to leave, she told me everyone would hear about it. She wasn't bluffing. Within days, the rumours started. That I'd stolen the inheritance. That I was greedy. That I'd turned my back on my family. Dylan texted once more. "You really think you deserve the same as us? For what?" I didn't reply. Then the letter arrived. Thick envelope, legal letterhead, a lawsuit demanding a share of the estate. My hands shook as I read it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I took it to Landon. He scanned it once and laughed. "This is fake," he said. The address didn't exist. The phone number was disconnected. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to scare me. I walked out of his office feeling colder than I ever had before. They weren't just disappointed anymore. They were desperate. After Landon told me the lawsuit was fake, the fear didn't disappear. It changed shape. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound outside my apartment made me sit up in bed. A car door slamming. Footsteps on the stairs. My phone lit up at 2 a.m. with a missed call from an unknown number. I'd never felt rich before, but suddenly I understood what it meant to feel hunted. Landon moved quickly. He sent a formal cease and desist letter to my mother and Greg, drafted in calm, airtight language. No threats, just facts. Any further attempts to intimidate me would be documented. Any contact would go through his office. When he asked if I wanted to include Dylan's name, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. "All of them." For the first time since this started, I felt something like control. It didn't stop them from trying. Rachel left a voicemail that same evening. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with outrage. She accused me of humiliating her, of dragging lawyers into private family matters. She said Greg was furious, that I was tearing the family apart. I listened to the message twice. Then I deleted it. Dylan tried a different approach. He showed up at my apartment without warning, standing in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, like this was a casual drop-in. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it. "You can't just cut us off," he said. "That's not how this works." "This is exactly how it works," I replied. He laughed, sharp and humorless. "You think you're better than us now?" "No," I said. "I think I'm done." The next message came from Greg. It was long and carefully written, the way people write when they think they're being reasonable. He reminded me of everything he'd provided: a roof, food, stability. He said families didn't keep score. He said money revealed character. I typed one sentence back before blocking his number. "You didn't include me in your will because I wasn't family. Remember that?" That silence lasted 3 days. Then Mrs. Donna Klein knocked on my door. She looked nervous, clutching her purse to her chest. She said she'd heard things around the neighbourhood, that Rachel had been telling people I'd taken advantage of an old woman, that I'd manipulated Margaret into leaving me everything. "I didn't believe it," she said quickly, "but there's something you should know." She told me that years ago, long before Greg's health scare, Rachel had met with a lawyer. Not Landon, someone else. Mrs. Klein remembered because Rachel had been crying on her porch afterward, saying things about making sure the future was secure and protecting the boys. I felt a cold line trace its way down my spine. That night I met Landon again. He slid a thin folder across the table. "There's one more document," he said. "Margaret instructed me to release it only if your family tried to coerce or threaten you." Inside was a letter, and copies of old paperwork, adoption records, amendments, dates that didn't line up with the story I'd been told my whole life. I wasn't Greg's child. I knew that. But buried in the documents was something worse. Rachel had known from the beginning. She'd signed the papers. She'd agreed to keep it quiet. She'd chosen peace over truth, over and over, until peace turned into leverage. Margaret had known too. She'd known, and she'd waited. I sat there, numb, as Landon explained what it meant, how airtight the trust was, how every move my family had made only strengthened my position. "They can't touch this," he said, "but they don't know what you know yet." I drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past my windshield. Every memory replayed itself with new meaning. The way my mother avoided certain questions. The way Greg said, "my sons," without thinking. The way I was always the one who could be moved, adjusted, sacrificed. Evan texted me that night. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I didn't mean to ask about the money. I just miss you." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I miss you too." That was the only thing that still felt real. The next morning, Landon scheduled a meeting. He said Rachel and Greg had requested it, suddenly eager to resolve things civilly. He asked if I wanted to attend. "Yes," I said, "I do." Not because I wanted peace, because I was ready for the truth to finally have witnesses. The conference room was colder than it needed to be, the kind of cold that made you sit up straighter without realizing it. A long table, leather chairs, a box of tissues placed exactly in the center, like someone had planned for tears in advance. Landon sat at one end with a legal pad in front of him, calm as ever. I chose a chair halfway down, close enough to speak, far enough not to be cornered. Rachel arrived first. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders tense, lips pressed tight. Greg followed a moment later, jaw set, eyes already irritated, like this whole thing was an inconvenience. Dylan came last, late on purpose, scanning the room like he was deciding who had the upper hand. No one hugged me. No one asked how I was. Greg broke the silence. "Let's get this over with." Landon nodded once. "This meeting is to clarify boundaries and address recent actions regarding Miss Carter's inheritance." "Family matters don't need lawyers," Greg snapped. "They do when the family threatens lawsuits," Landon replied evenly. Rachel shot me a look that flickered between anger and something closer to fear. "We just want what's fair," she said. "That's all we've ever wanted." I felt my chest tighten at the word fair. Landon slid a folder onto the table. "The trust left by Margaret Carter names Mia as the sole beneficiary. There are no contingencies, no shared clauses, no discretionary distributions. It's airtight." Dylan scoffed. "So that's it? She gets everything?" "Yes," Landon said. "That's it." Greg leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "That woman barely knew her. This makes no sense." "That's not true," I said quietly. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. She watched. She paid attention. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. I could see her hands shaking now. "There's more," Landon said. He pulled out a second envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a thin strip of tape. He placed it on the table, but didn't open it yet. "Margaret instructed me to release this only if there were attempts to coerce or intimidate Mia," he continued. "Those attempts have been documented." Greg laughed sharply. "This is ridiculous." Landon met his eyes. "I suggest you listen." He opened the envelope. Inside were copies of documents, adoption records, amendments, signatures I recognized before my brain fully caught up. My mother's signature, Rachel Carter, dated years ago. The room went very still. Landon spoke carefully. "These papers confirm that Mia was legally adopted in infancy. They also confirm that Ms. Carter, Rachel, was fully aware of this and agreed to keep it confidential." Rachel's face was drained of color. "You knew," I said, turning to her. It wasn't a question. She swallowed. "I was trying to protect everyone." Greg's head snapped toward her. "What does that mean?" She didn't look at him. "It means it was complicated." Dylan pushed his chair back slightly. You said she wasn't really... I said what I had to say, Rachel cut in, her voice cracking. I thought it would be easier if we didn't talk about it. I felt something shift inside me, like a lock finally clicking open. So, when you told me I wasn't family, I said, looking at Greg, you were repeating a story that was convenient, not the truth. Greg didn't answer. He looked at Rachel like he was seeing her for the first time. Landon continued. Margaret was aware of all of this. Her letter states that she chose Mia precisely because she understood the dynamics at play. He slid the letter toward them. No one reached for it. This meeting isn't about negotiation, Landon said. It's about notice. Any further harassment will be addressed legally. I stood there, slowly, deliberately. I didn't ask for this, I said. Not the money, not the truth. But now that I have both, I'm not giving either of them away. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Mia, I shook my head. You made your choices. This is mine. I walked out of that room without looking back. My hands were steady. My steps were light. They thought the will was the end of the story. For me, it was the beginning. I didn't feel triumphant when I left the building. There was no rush, no victory lap, just a strange, quiet clarity, the kind that settles in after something heavy finally drops. For the first time, I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped wondering what I should have said differently. The truth was out, not just on paper, but in the open, where it could no longer be reshaped or softened for someone else's comfort. I didn't cut them off in anger. I did it methodically. Landon handled the formalities, cease and desist notices, documented timelines, a clear paper trail. I blocked numbers, archived emails. I learned how much peace can come from deciding that access to you is a privilege, not a right. What they didn't know, what I didn't correct, was that Margaret had left more than money behind. She'd kept records, old emails, notes from meetings she'd attended quietly, sitting in the back of rooms where decisions were made without me. Copies of documents that showed how narratives had been adjusted over the years, always in the same direction, always away from me. I wasn't in a hurry to use any of it. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. I let them sit in silence, with the unanswered questions, with the realization that every move they made from now on would be measured against what I might know, against what could still come out. They thought cutting me out would make things simple. All it did was give me permission to stop protecting them. Whatever happens next won't be loud, it won't be messy, it will be precise. And when the time comes, they'll understand something I learned far too young. Paper has power, and I finally know how to use it. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit subscribe. This story isn't really about money. It's about what people reveal when they think you don't have power or protection. Like the video if you've seen favoritism tear families apart, and share it with someone who's been hurt by family decisions that were anything but fair. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. I read every story. Yours might be the next one I tell.